joining in this sunny Friday afternoon to our fifth speaker series event. As you might all know, we, with the Public Policy and Governance Unit, put up this speaker series together with the aim of bringing original fieldwork research focused on Kosovo rule of law and democratization related issues. So far we have put together and touched upon sensitive issues which lay at the very foundations of the core and the implementation of rule of law reforms in Kosovo, such as juvenile justice reform, property rights, constitutional reform, and perhaps today we will shift a bit the attention from problems, or let's say problematic, towards a more agent-oriented perspective and looking at real interaction between agents, let's say, involved in the process of promoting rule of law in Kosovo. And particularly today, Shpend will talk about the EU and get you introduced with a really, let's say, a problem or a topic that was broadly discussed in the academic community related to the democratic deficit. Perhaps Shpend will get you more introduced and acquainted with this term. It is related to matters of accountability and transparency in the EU. But what we tend to look at is usually international organizations are seen as actors that, let's say, export let's say best practice to countries such as Kosovo. But in this case, we will look at whether this democratic deficit or problems related to the EU per se are being exported, let's say, in countries such as Kosovo. So I won't just take much more time and open the floor to Shpend. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Michael, for organizing this and putting all of this together. Some of you have to write an essay, I was told, about this. So whenever it is important, I will tell you, please write this down. It should be in the essay. Basically, the idea behind this came not only from my academic interest, but from my political interest as well. Living in Kosovo for, like many of you, for a long time, basically, we see the situation and how it's going and try to make sense of the situation around us. And basically, the whole concept of this came because as humans, we try to find the cause of problems because we think by finding the cause that we've explained everything. Or maybe to say it in a more blunt way, we try to blame other people as to what is happening. I don't want to say that my presentation is about blaming the EU, but it is about criticizing the EU approach in general, especially in the Balkans. So I have chosen this topic, which is called the democracy deficit, and EU vis-à-vis Kosovo, and basically how that democracy deficit, first of all, is inherent in the organizations such as the EU, but also in terms of what kind of deficit does it create in Kosovo, especially with the policies that it has towards us. And we start with just some of the underlying questions that always make me think about these things. Basically, what is the future that we want in the Balkans? And if you want a definition of the Balkans, it's really a nasty place in southeastern Europe where people used to fight with each other. So, and still there is a risk of people fighting with each other. At least that's how every time I go to Brussels, this is the impression that I get from talking to people there. They think of us as a post-conflict environment, but actually, to tell you the truth, I think of it, when I talk to them, I see that they talk of it as a pre-conflict society. So what I mean is that, yes, we are a post-conflict environment because we fought wars, almost everybody with each other. But at the same time, when I say pre-conflict, is because the EU believes that there is a high risk of a renewed conflict because there are so many unfinished business. So, and I will explain what that means. What is the future that we want for Kosovo? What are the goals of the people of Kosovo? And this is for people who have lived in the 90s. And for those of you who don't know, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the people of Kosovo were among the first ones who wanted democratic changes. So basically, there is no doubt in anybody's mind that democratization is the goal of the people of Kosovo. If you remember the demonstrations and protests in the 90s with two fingers up, people shouting for victory, seeking democracy the way they saw it in the Western world. And we were among the first regions in the Balkans and in ex-Yugoslavia that promoted the multi-party system that when we moved from the Communist Party. Despite the fact that there were not a lot of political parties organized in the 90s, because LDK was more of a movement that basically all the people were part of, but we have to understand that in those occupying times we organized two sets of general elections which were considered by many to be fair and democratic, and to tell you the truth, even more democratic than we have them now. But also we organized a referendum at that time, which basically there was one question about how the people, how they want to see Kosovo in the future, and I think that there was almost unanimous voting, almost 99% of the people voted for an independent republic of Kosovo. So just to make sure that I think, or we have enough proof to say that the goal of the people of Kosovo and the Balkans in general is, how this series is actually called, democratization. Democratization of the Balkans, democratization of Kosovo, but I do not want to call this process just democratization, because somehow it feels like we are a subject and everybody else is trying to democratize us. Because I don't think that democracy is something that basically is passed over in the sense that it's forced, but it's something that is learned and comes from the people. And the question is then, what is the role and what are the goals of the EU in Kosovo and the Balkans? So are they promoting this goal? Are they working on democratizing Kosovo? Or are we actually, through these processes that I will mention in my next slides, basically, maybe it's a step backwards, and these are questions that I'm asking. I don't have a final answer to say, yes, this is the case, but definitely worth considering. When we look at these concepts, students who have taken public policy classes with me know that I use 2 or 3 examples in class to show how democracy has operated in Kosovo, especially in terms of public policy. Because I see public policy as a very important process in democratizing the country, where you have a participatory process where issues come from the public, they are widely discussed, policy options are thought of, and then decisions are made and policies are implemented. And I think it's a very important public policy process. But in the past we've seen that through this European integration process in Kosovo, we have had legislation that was basically copy-paste. And I mentioned this case of in 2005, where the Parliament of Kosovo at that time, even under the UN, passed this law on the protection of animal rights, which is one of the most advanced pieces of legislation that you would see in any country in Europe. But you have to wonder, when was this issue discussed by the Kosovo public? How did it come on the public agenda? Why was it so important that we have this most advanced piece of legislation? And you could see the consequences when 2 years later the municipality of Pristina publishes a tender for hunting companies to shoot stray dogs. So that was in direct violation of the legislation, because when I say most advanced legislation, I'm talking about humane treatment of animals, and hunting and shooting stray dogs is obviously not one of them. So not even the municipality, they did not just break the law, they actually subsidized breaking the law, because they were paying hunting companies to shoot stray dogs. At that time, the head of the municipality even got a letter from Brigitte Bardot, the French actress, who is the leader in Europe for animal rights, to say, what are you doing, here is your legislation. More recently, we have had 2 cases. One is, of course, the issue with gay rights in Kosovo, because in our constitution, again, it is one of the most, I would say, advanced in terms of human rights, because the constitution, there is a paragraph that does not allow for discrimination based on ethnicity, race, gender, but also sexuality, sexual orientation. And at the same time, we have a marriage law that says that marriage is a union between a man and a woman. Now, first of all, constitution was something that we got. And basically it was given to us as a package, and they were told, here is the constitution, you have short time to discuss it, but basically it's something that we received mostly from the international community and then in cooperation with some local stakeholders, but we had only 1 week of public discussions. Now, of course, we did not have a case when a gay couple would want to get married in Kosovo, because they would be refused, and then they would have to sue the municipality and go to the constitutional court to check whether we actually have these advanced rights for sexual minorities or not. And the third case was when in one of the tax legislations in Kosovo, when discussed in Parliament, there was a sentence that was referring to the tax on the coast, and it was talking about the coast, and Kosovo does not have a coast. And basically they figured out that because it was copy-pasted legislation from countries in Europe, mostly from Italy in that sense, that they forgot to remove some of the references that were talking about that country. If you think about it, only the laws from the Ahtisaari package, that were 46 pieces of legislation, were passed in 2 days. There was not even a slight discussion in the parliament. In the morning they passed the first reading. In the afternoon there were some committees, and the next day we passed 46 laws, and we are expected to implement them. So in that sense, Kosovo is full of examples like this, and the question that comes to my mind is, can actually legislation be copy-pasted? Because if you're looking at the EU integration process, there is, of course, a tendency to set the agenda from above. There is not enough room to discuss it, but the question is, can legislation be copy-pasted like that? And also, can democracy be copy-pasted? And that is the key word here, is, does it require only legislation, only written laws, constitution, or are we talking about democracy as a process that inevitably should happen in one nation or with the people in order to get to the results of democracy that we all want? Just to set some definitions straight, democracy deficit is a term that was coined by David Marquand in his work Parliament for Europe, and it has been used for institutions that fail to fulfill general principles of democracy. It is true of regional organizations. Basically, it means that decisions are made not through representative democracy mechanisms that we have in the country. So there is a possibility that people of Poland could be completely against a specific legislation, but if the EU decides about it, then they should follow that law. So there is a democracy deficit within the individual countries of the EU. This is inevitable in regional organizations or political organizations such as the EU. So basically we're saying that are the people of Greece being asked about what they want today? And of course this has caused now a lot of problems because of the financial troubles that Europe underwent, that we have these discussions in Greece where it seems that the majority of the population are against some of the cuts that the government is making, but because the EU has conditioned those with the financial package that they're going to send, they have to accept it, or they have demonstrations as we see now, so the situation is a little bit on the verge. So just to understand this concept, that's what we mean by democracy deficit. Now there is even a more radical term, which is a democratic disconnect, which is basically where it's beyond the means of the people of a country to change or influence institutions. The difference between the EU and the United States is that EU has only one parliament, one house, one chamber, which is the Parliament of Europe, which basically brings members of parliament from all the countries, but it is based on the size of the country. So Germany would have the biggest numbers in the member of parliament. They don't have, like the US, the Senate and the House of Representatives, one that guarantees equality between states. So now everybody thinks that basically Germany and France are the two biggest nations in EU. They are the decision makers. If they are on board, then everything is decided just because of the power that they have, both politically but financially as well. If we move to why am I saying that the current EU integration process and how they treat Kosovo is hurting democracy. The first stage of any policy cycle is agenda setting. It's basically when we discuss how do issues become important in a country. For example, why do we today in Kosovo discuss electricity prices, and why there are protests, and how does that issue become top of the agenda so that there is government response to that. And basically there are a lot of theoretical work written about this, but I will mention one which is important, which is this concept developed by Cobb, which is the agenda setting patterns. And they say that basically agenda issues can come three ways on the agenda. One is outside initiation, that people, for example, pay high electricity prices. And all of a sudden they see that electricity is a big part of their household budget. So they become concerned. They raise the issue, they protest, politicians talk about it, policy analysts talk about it, issue gets picked up by the media, and all of a sudden it's on the government agenda and they're dealing with it. This is typical of democratic countries. So this would be the best way to put issues on the agenda. When the people are asking for something, all the books on democratic theory would say that this is the best way to do it. Second, which is typical of autocracies, is what we call mobilization, which is when the government decides that something is important for the people and then tries to mobilize support for it. This is the top-down setting of agenda. This is true, as I said, of, I don't want to say dictatorial regimes, but certainly totalitarian types of regimes where the government believes that it knows best what is good for the people. There are plenty of examples. I'm not saying that it's a non-working theory, but definitely is something that we've seen somewhere else. And inside initiation is when a group that is close to the government convinces the government that something is important so that they should push it. And these are, of course, interest groups and lobbyists, various who push for agenda items. In Kosovo, I've explained many times, for example, the Association of War Veterans used to be very close to the government. So whenever they would need something from the government, despite the fact that it was not being widely discussed by the public, they would ask for something and they would push for those changes. And I'm saying that the EU integration process in general is more of a B type. It's more of a mobilization type, because the EU comes and says, do you want to be a member of the European Union? And you say, yes. And they say, here is the list of things that you need to do. And that is basically legislation starting from taxes to human rights. They have a limit to what you can do, and they say this is what you should do. For example, for VAT, which is value-added tax, which is important for students who pay VAT on education. I never understand why we tax education as if we have too much education and we need to tax it. But EU allows for 3 levels of VAT that the government of Kosovo has rarely used. But it tells you that there is not enough space to move if you want to do more creative taxes, because this is the EU integration process. So that is on agenda setting. The second important thing that I want to mention is that one of the 2 most important steps in the policy cycle are policy formulation and implementation. Formulation assumes that in a democratic society, once you have issues on the agenda, that there is wide discussion in the public about the possible ways on how to deal with these problems. And policy implementation assumes that there is not a lot of what we call the principal-agent gap. People who teach management know this very well, and when we talk about US companies as whether the owner is distant from the manager, in public policy we use this term to say, are the people who are implementing the laws very distant from the people who are coming up with the laws? Basically, when a police officer implements a law, does he or she know what the lawmakers had in mind when they came up with this legislation? We have a lot of problems in this type of implementation. We see it in all kinds of issues in Kosovo. But if we're saying that legislation is thought of in Italy and is being implemented in Kosovo, then this principal-agent gap is really wide. Because you're not even trying to think what the people of Kosovo had in mind, but you're thinking what the EU had in mind when they actually did this. And you're expected to implement legislation which is far more advanced and far more complicated than what we should have in Kosovo. Summarizing this first part is basically questions that need to be asked is who sets the agenda in all of these countries? Are all choices available to policymakers? Is there a wide gap between the principal and the agent resulting in good implementation of policies? And the main question is, are decisions in Kosovo made outside of the normal mechanisms of representative democracy? Does anyone in Kosovo actually believe that decisions are made in the parliament? Does anyone actually believe that decisions are made within the government? Or do the people believe that it's the Americans and the Europeans who make the decisions, and at the end of the day we are just implementing some of the policies that were thought by other people? EU foreign policy in the Balkans, well, first of all, I would just say what is, I'm transmitting what it says on their website. The EU claims that the European Union has its own foreign and security policy which has developed gradually over many years and which enables it to speak and act as one in world affairs. Kosovo is the best example why this is not true. Because out of the 27 countries, 22 have recognized us and 5 have not. If there would be an EU common foreign policy, it would be a decision by the European Union to recognize, and they would make all members of the European Union to recognize. And actually they say, when I criticized them about this in Brussels, they told me, well actually we have a common foreign policy in Kosovo, which is we agree to disagree. They have allowed these 5 countries not to recognize Kosovo because despite the Lisbon Treaty that actually sets up this beautiful foreign policy speaking in one voice, if I am a Kosovo government representative, I would rather speak to a Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany than I would speak to an EU official, because I genuinely believe that the power lies within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Germany rather than Catherine Ashton, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the EU. I don't know if you know Stefan Füle, this guy who comes, who is the EU Commissioner for Enlargement. He's a Czech citizen, and he comes and talks to us about visa liberalization, how this is something that is going to happen very soon in Kosovo. Well, last month I was in Paris in meetings with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the guy who was in charge there of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was telling me, who is this clown Füle? He was referring to Füle as the clown. He said, who is this clown that goes there and promises visa liberalization to you? It's not going to happen, because we are the ones who make the decision. At the end of the day, it's the ministries of internal affairs of all countries that should make the choice about visa liberalization. So I say the EU's common foreign and security policy has been further strengthened by the 2009 Lisbon Treaty, which created the post of EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, and this is Catherine Ashton that you all know had her birthday just 2 days ago. We found out about it because our Prime Minister bought her a present. I just also want to mention this links to US policy, and maybe this is of interest to Louis as well, who has been following this US foreign policy in the Balkans. After the wars in the Balkans, EU and US were of the opinion that the Balkans needed to be stabilized. And in the years 2000-2008, the Bush administration basically was in favor of 3 things that they thought could stabilize the Balkans. And one is, of course, admission of Croatia, Macedonia, and Albania to NATO. The Macedonia one failed because of the Greek veto. Second was recognition of Macedonia with its full name, Republic of Macedonia, not using the Führer, so the US decision, much to the surprise of the Greeks. And third was Kosovo independence. You remember when Bush went to Tirana and said, enough is enough, Kosovo has to be independent. It was a foreign policy choice of the US. And basically I think it's, again, like in previous times in history, when the US administration had to step in where EU was divided and undecided. So basically, we've seen it in Bosnia, we've seen it in everywhere else. And when I talk to US officials, the thing that pisses them off about the European Union is because they can never get them to speak with one voice. And this was true also of the intervention in Iraq. Afghanistan was different because it came just after 9/11. But they thought that in the Balkans we need to do this. EU, on the other hand, had one policy, which was stabilization through enlargement. Basically, you are crazy people who are fighting with each other, but if we get you fast enough in the EU, then we're all going to be fine. So we try to stabilize the region by getting them into the European Union. This is the policy of EU that they've mentioned so many times. But the problem is that EU is tired of enlargement. They don't want new countries because of financial problems. Croatia is going to join there very soon, but I think for the rest of us there is a long period of waiting to get in. The two forces, US and EU, agree on one thing, which I say stability. Stability above everything else. Nothing comes before stability, not even democracy. Stability even at the cost of democracy. Balkans has an EU future, but enlargement fatigue has made them a more distant perspective, and individual countries' foreign policy is competing with that of EU for different reasons. So when you say stability, stability, and nothing else, you're basically also, and I will. I just want to explain that we say stability is very important, but integration is not coming anytime soon. Financial crisis, everybody in the region has negative growth except for Kosovo because of its highway investments. So Serbia is heavily in debt. Macedonia has seen negative growth of economy. Macedonia and Albania the same way. So tensions are growing in the region. The EU on the other side cannot guarantee that integration will happen soon. Then this paradigm of stability becomes more important than everything else, even if it means that they're going to interfere politically within a country. For people who follow Serbia, they know that the EU had invested heavily in Tadic, which was this Democratic Party person. They kept telling Kosovo that you should talk to this guy because if Nikolic wins, then it would be catastrophe. All the region is going to go to hell if the radicals win in Serbia. And they invested heavily, interfering heavily also in internal politics. And they failed because Nikolic won. And now they come and tell us that Nikolic is the guy because if he's radical, he's the one who is going to make compromises. So they shift policy based on what goes on just for the sake of keeping the situation calm. As I say, this is a long process of copy-pasting legislation. Individual countries are now basically very tired of the process. And I just want to finish with a slide that says as a result. Kosovo is even more complicated due to several international organizations that are in Kosovo. I keep saying all the time, it's like when people tell you how to ride the bike, they hold the bike for you. But in Kosovo, there is EULEX, UN, KFOR, embassies, all of these international organizations, including ICO. It's 5 people holding the bike. You don't even see the bike. And I claim that if you want to learn how to ride a bike, you need to let go. You might fall down, but that's a part of the process of learning, because otherwise it's not going to happen. As part of this concept of what the EU does and the democracy deficit that it's setting up in Kosovo, agenda setting is completely top-down through a mobilization model. If you go to the website of the government of Kosovo, every week there is a government meeting. Just go over the items that they've discussed, and you will see that for 90% of them, you won't even know what the hell they're talking about and why is this issue on the agenda. I'm not saying that in the US people know what is being discussed by the US government, but in a much smaller place at the beginning of our country democratization process, it is funny to see animal rights legislation on government agenda. I'm not saying it's not important, I'm just saying that there are other things that I think people are willing to discuss more. Policy formulation is narrow, with low participatory process. You don't get to widely discuss issues, especially if they have to do with minorities. And today, all those 46 pieces of legislation by Ahtisaari were considered to be somehow linked with minorities, so they were not up for discussion. You cannot discuss. If you remember last week, the Parliament decided to discuss this Kicina issue, which is a verdict by a court on a war crime issue that most of the people in Kosovo believe it was unfair how it was done. The Parliament decided to discuss it, and it was immediately we received a letter from the EU that they are very disappointed that the Parliament discusses this. So even when the Parliament, I'm not saying it was the right thing to do, to discuss the Kicina issue, but if we are a sovereign country and the Parliament is the sovereign of the nation, the Republic, there is no role for the EU to tell them what to discuss and what not. Principal agent gap is growing and implementation is suffering as a result. And the most troubling for me is when I see EU officials coming to Kosovo and telling us that Kosovo is doing really splendid and well, and that we have achieved progress in the reforms. If those reforms means passing legislation, we are probably the best parliament in the world, because we pass them faster than anyone else, sometimes even without reading them. But on the ground, there is a question about whether people have changed in this democratization process. Do we really believe that we participate in a democratic society? And how do we see these rights? Or are we just playing a game, and I say all the time without meaning to offend anyone, that the definition of a banana republic is one that is concerned more with procedures rather than substance. So when our president goes to Macedonia, we are more worried whether there was a red carpet for her or not, and not what they have discussed. And sometimes to me it seems that when I watch the parliament, that we are more into process than substance. And we should not fool ourselves, and this is a message that should be sent both to the EU and our politicians, that we are actually seeing a huge democracy deficit in our country, almost to a point where we've reached a disconnect with our politicians, because people have started to lose faith that they can change things. If you talk to people and say, is the situation bad? And they say it is, but there is nothing we can do about it, then you know that there is a complete disconnect where people don't believe that they have enough power to change and influence things. Thank you.
Questions?
Before we get to wine. Madam?
I have a question regarding the agenda setting. We see recently that in our democratic society it's harder and harder to mobilize people, and I want to ask what would happen with an agenda if people cannot mobilize, but we cannot say that the problem doesn't exist. So as we know from the public policy, if the government don't see the people speaking loud about their problem, they automatically will consider that the problem wouldn't exist. So my question is, what will happen for our problems if they exist and we cannot mobilize and we cannot solve them?
Well, nothing will have a democracy disconnect, what I think happens. You know that I have an inclination to protest from time to time. And I believe, and I'm talking here about basically speaking for our rights, because I believe that's a necessary step in any democratization process. I do not think that rights are won individually but collectively, and I think if it wasn't, for example, for the civil rights movement in the United States, I actually don't believe that Obama would be president today. And that's what I keep telling the European and American officials when they come to Kosovo, because they see us as if we're living in the same time frame, but we are these ethnicities, tribes that fight with each other. Not everybody, of course, but I'm talking about the fact that maybe they should see us as if they are themselves, but 30 years before. So maybe we are where Germany was 30 or 40 years ago. And this is a process that takes time, and it should not be forced, and it cannot be forced. Because if you try to bring these models of liberal democracy to a country that is, or society that is highly paternalistic like Kosovo, then I think the result is that the whole thing gets captured by politicians and networks. It's inevitable. For example, and I discussed this, I think, with Luka, that for 13 years we are talking about women's rights in Kosovo. I've been to at least 15 conferences in those 13 years. UNIFEM, all these women's rights organizations, and if you ask me today, I don't think that women's rights are where they should be 13 years after the war and the conflict. And I'm saying it's a process, but maybe it doesn't come through just talking, but actually doing, and I always believe that employment is the best way to promote women's rights. Another example of copy-pasting legislation, because some of our students are doing research on this. Today you get inheritance if you're a child from your parent equally, whether you're male or female, but that doesn't happen on the ground. Wealth is split between the male children of Kosovo families. It happens in cities, but not in rural areas. It is unheard of for a female child to get part of the wealth from the parents. And this is something that we never discussed as a society. Legislation was brought. You can sue your brothers to get, and probably you would win in court, and maybe that's a necessary step, but most of the women do not even know that this right exists. Today we have very advanced legislation in unions, no marriages. People don't know that. Male and female living together, they can split the wealth after they're separated, even if they're not married, for the wealth they gained while they were together. Again, this is copy-pasted from the EU, but not implemented at all in Kosovo. So I think, you know, this hurts us when you feel that you don't have power to change things. And now these issues with the energy is something that I believe that people think they can change something because it's very close to them. It hurt them in their pockets. If you pay, which is now they say more than half of your monthly income on electricity, then there are studies that show, for example, if you spend 40% of your household monthly income on food, that's a revolution. That's when Tahrir Square happened in Egypt. That's when most of the revolutions happened. And Kosovo in last year's census was 38%. So 38% of the monthly income of people goes for food. If it passes 40, then people believe that the situation has gone really bad. Yes, Rina.
I am Rinan Castrati. It was a really impressive discussion. I liked it very much. My point is related to your line you draw between stability and democracy. For us living here, we understand that every time we do something that is that makes stability something that will be bad, the Europeans will say to us, you cannot do this. But if we are subject of the lack of democracy, they will say, for example, I don't care because there is still stability. So the lack of democracy does not necessarily mean that there is a case for non-stability.
Yeah.
My point is here. If we tell the Europeans, the people, that if we have a lack of democracy, we will make riots and all these things, and you will have to do some things that will save stability. So if this happens, do you think that it's a good idea? Do you think that we should be afraid that that will escalate more, or that only will make these people afraid, and so they will try to change things?
I think by suffocating small discussions of people and that it threatens stability little, if you suffocate it, I think it piles up and then it blows. That's my opinion. I always have that when you try to say shush, shush for everything, you say, okay, okay, I understand. But we've come to a point where before we want something, we're thinking what Europe is going to say to us. I take this issue of where I disagree with many people, which is the unification with Albania. if Kosovo is a truly independent country, should it have the right to do whatever it wants with itself? Every country, with one exception, Austria, it has in its constitution the Anschluss, which is, it forbidden to join another country. It was because of Germany and Hitler and everything else. Kosovo is the only other country that has a limitation in its constitution about what it wants to do. And most of the people I talk to in Kosovo have this question of, we should not be asking for it because Europe would never allow it. So and if you talk to Europeans, it's a question of stability. They think that just being discussed would destabilize the region, because immediately you would have domino effects in Bosnia, where Republika Srpska would ask to join with Serbia, and what's going to happen to Albanians in Macedonia. So I'm taking a bigger issue, but the Kishina issue, there are, and I'm telling you this from experience, you have so many embassy people wandering around the parliament that it's very strange. Whenever there is a vote on something, they go and put pressure saying, oh, maybe you shouldn't vote this. It was immense pressure when the law on Hoća Male, which is a minority-related issue, was voted in the parliament. They were calling each member of parliament on the phone and telling them that, you know, there is a strong consideration for this by the EU. Be careful about what you do when you vote. Now, I understand completely international politics. And I understand that Kosovo is a small place, and some things we can do, some things we can't. But it should not be an obstacle about what we want. Whether we can achieve something is another thing. You know, we're dependent on the EU, we're dependent on the US. That is a fact. Nobody can say that that's not a fact. But to suffocate all kinds of destabilization small, I think, is a very huge liability for the future. Because in the future it might blow up and then it becomes a huge problem. I was discussing with Louis, and I do not mean to draw any parallels with Kosovo, but for example, when if you've seen the movie Argo, you know what I'm talking about in terms of Iran and how it was treated. That in the 50s there was a government that nationalized the oil industry, which was not okay for the British. The British and the Americans organized a coup which brought down this Prime Minister Mossadegh, and they put there the Shah, which was highly brutal dictatorship, which led to the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And I think it was things piling up all the time. And now we're dealing with a large security threat in the Middle East, because I don't want to say that that's the whole thing you want to blame, but when we see these kinds of situations, then obviously the country is threatened to be destabilized by other things in the future. It's okay sometimes to, you know, when I was in the civil society and we would organize protests, we would receive calls from the embassies and donors and saying, yeah, is this something that you really want to do, or you're fighting for these kinds of things. And I think that if we want to build a democratic society, members of parliament, I know that some of them are not good in terms of quality and what you would wish in a member of parliament, but they are elected people. They are the sovereign of the nation. Louis, please.
I have a question, sort of question and a comment. I mean, on one hand, stability is not necessarily a bad thing anywhere, in particular here. However, there's various kinds of stability, and I guess my comment or question is, I mean, well, there's two types of stability that are issued in this discussion. One is sort of external stability, international stability within the Balkans, among the states and the peoples of the Balkans. And then there's another type of internal stability, is an internal system within one state, let's say Kosovo. Is that stable? And I mean, from my perspective, you're absolutely right that both of those stabilities have been imposed from without. I also think, by and large, with good intentions. I hear you, and I think you're also right that that type of stability is not necessarily, people don't necessarily buy into it. So there's an issue of legitimacy. Is this stability legitimate, either in the international sense or in the eyes of the people within a system? And you didn't say so, but you seem to be pointing in the direction that it's not. Mm-hmm. And so I guess the question now, finally, is what do you see happening in the future? Can you go on this way and gain legitimacy for this system if it lasts long enough and it doesn't bring war and it brings some kind of prosperity to the region, or not? And then if not, what are the threats to the stability?
Well, I've been doing a lot of readings on failed states and different models that were written all the way from Chomsky to now the most recent book by Ghani Ashraf-Ghani from Afghanistan, talking about what are the signs of a failed state. And I think that we're dangerously approaching that. Not just in terms of institutions and working institutions, but the quality of life and how people expect things from the state and whether those things are being delivered. And I think that the normal process, how I would see it, is, especially in this light of this dialogue, because I consider Serbia and Kosovo not to be normal countries. I don't think they are normal countries. Serbia, because of, it still keeps Kosovo in its constitution. I don't think a lot of things have changed, doing much better than us, for sure. And I don't think Kosovo is normal because of everything that I mentioned in terms of all these international organizations and everything going on. So trying to normalize relations between two abnormal countries, for me, is accepting that they are abnormal, and for me that is not acceptable. I think that we should work on normalizing these two countries, and normalization of relations is a consequence of that process. Why I'm saying I agree with you that stability is not necessarily a bad thing, but because of stability, for example, because of the dialogue, when European officials come to Kosovo, they do not talk about corruption that much. And I want EU to talk about corruption more, to say this is not accepted in Europe, to talk about these things. But because of stability, that the dialogue process is more important than anything else, then they forego corruption. And we're suffering internally, as you say, more than we're suffering externally. Maybe to the outside world we look like really like a normal functioning country, but internally we're not. And we shouldn't lie to ourselves. And I think it's inevitable that at a certain point in time, because also of the EU fatigue of enlargement, that there's going to be, in my view, unrest. And the question is what kind of unrest. And I do not foresee a conflict between two countries, but I see internal issues, because simply a country like this, remittances are falling. Not, only from Switzerland last year, they've fallen by 22%. The remittances are keeping this place alive. If diaspora does not send money, then we're facing even more difficult economic times. And we're going to look for people to blame. And of course, I hope that it doesn't start with Serbia and say, Serbia is guilty of everything, or the EU is guilty. And I hope that we find it in ourselves, try to find some responsibility and say what we do. But I certainly do not expect the situation to be sustained like this. Stefan Füle, last time he came, he said there is not going to be visa liberalization in Kosovo for at least 3 years. And we were told that they're going to be this year. I don't think that's the solution. I don't think the solution is to run away from Kosovo, but it seems that every process is going longer than we thought. We are the only isolated place in the Balkans that cannot move without visas. So that's why I see some problems, but I do not necessarily see that as a bad thing that is going to, some dissatisfaction is good for Europe to hear us, because sometimes they do not hear us unless there is more voices. I see this, 2,000 people have protested about electricity. The response from the international community has been very interesting. They started calling the government and saying, find out what happened with those bills. They now are putting pressure on the government to fire people in KEK, fire the board. I even think that the minister is going to go because of this. But for the first time, they see some sort of civic activity that they are afraid of. And of course, what is scaring them also is this registration of the new Islamic party, which is the Vizia Bashkohu, which is causing huge discussion in our society. Should we allow it? Why is this going? And the international community, especially the US administration, is quite worried about these types of things. Yes.
I'm Dora Osmani, senior in European Studies and EU Law within University of Bremen. I completely agree with you about foreign and security policy of European Union, because we are all we witnessed that they failed in several cases, especially in Georgia conflict, ex-Yugoslavia, and in our case. But do you have any idea, or do you think that the leading parties of the states which didn't recognize us, if they are going to change, do you think that this can be a difference within this policy? Because this happens also with Turkey. Yeah.
Cyprus said that they will never recognize Kosovo, and with the internal problems, I don't expect Slovakia the same way. I don't expect big changes, and that's why I was surprised why the 22 big countries, who are the most powerful ones, did not make the 5 countries actually recognize. I do not think they're going to change their mind, because there is no incentive to change their mind.
Yeah, but what if the main leading parties are going to change in the near future?
When I went to Slovakia, I met with both SDKU and the opposition, and they were fighting with each other who's more against Kosovo's independence. So there was like a quarrel as to, no, I'm more against this than you. And I do not expect that. But to tell you the truth, I will say this again. As a politician, I rather spend days in Berlin than in Brussels. Brussels is a waste of time compared to Berlin when you want to get things accomplished. You know, it's a bunch of bureaucrats who don't have decision-making power, apart from the integration process, which is far ahead from us, which is fine. But in Berlin, you get to speak to Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who puts conditions on Serbia, who mentions things to the Prime Minister about corruption, all these things, you know. Paris is the same. If there is going to be any change, it's going to come from the powerful countries, not from the will of these, because Serbia is not going to recognize us. And even yesterday, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Merkic of Serbia, was saying that he actually managed to convince even 2 countries to retract their recognition from Africa. Of course, they're talking about Sao Tome and Principe that retracted the recognition, and also Mali, which is this big discussion whether they did it or not. The thing is that I'd rather have Kosovo be compared to Slovenia and say you're -10, than to compare us to Palestine and say you're +2. And I think they're comparing us in many cases to these places that are not what I would like to see as a normal country, right? We don't want a backdoor process to the EU. Normal process is fine, but we should be treated as a normal country, and we're not. And I think neither is Serbia being treated that way.
You made a very good presentation identifying the problems that we have here in Kosovo and some of the problems that the EU is facing as well. But what's your opinion? What is the solution about the situation that we have right now? Which I personally, as an individual, would be glad to hear, that because the changes start individually and then grow as well. You mentioned the EU and the USA and some other countries which have a huge impact on the decision making and all the processes that go on domestically here in Kosovo. But if we start to change things around, do we risk of losing this relations that we have right now with them?
I don't think there's a risk of losing the relation, but there is a risk of being left out of the discussions that are currently going in the EU. And I'm not talking about the Brussels institutions. I'm actually talking about the philosophical discussions that are happening all over Germany, France, about the future of the EU. You know, in Greece, in Spain, in Italy. Next year we're going to have Catalonia voting for independence from Spain. Scotland in 2014 votes for independence. Iceland has decided to give up on its EU bid. There are a lot of changes. People are wondering whether the EU has a clear future. And I think we should be included in those discussions. We should be part of those discussions and not be left through this old enlargement process, which for sure it's not going to be used in years to come. Because EU is figuring out whether they can exist, and that's why I mentioned that there are some ideological people like Carl Bildt, Robert Cooper, who have written about this, who say that the only way for the EU to survive is to become like an empire. And when I say empire, I don't think of 19th and 20th century empires. I'm talking about a superpower in Europe that actually speaks with one voice, but also has centers of power within Europe. And they talk about liquid sovereignty, regions rather than countries, and they say this is the only way Europe can survive, considering China, Russia, the US, and these growing powers. If that is the discussion in Europe, why are we not part of that? And that is easier, you know, we're not stupid people. We can discuss about this, we can discuss about the future. And I think for us important is to be part of those discussions. Rather than just going through these bureaucratic processes where they tell us which legislation to pass and whatnot. And as I always say, the solution is to let go of the bike. And we will fall, but it's very difficult to explain to a government how to save money unless they've gone through a fiscal crisis. Our government was never allowed to go through a fiscal crisis. Every time we were in trouble, we were saved. If you had a question like in Bosnia, when at one point the government was left with 20 convertible marks in the treasury, and then you start thinking about how you're going to do it, then you know that becomes a little bit more still learning process. I don't see it any other way. Can we go to wine now?
Let me ask for
Yes.
I'll ask a variant of the same question in a way. I mean, you talked about going to the powerful countries, Germany as opposed to Brussels, and I can certainly understand that. On the internal side, what's the equivalent in terms of getting the attention of the international community or of the powerful countries? And this process of growing demonstrations about electricity bills, but there's really more to it. Is that something that's going to get larger? Are we going to see a Kosovo Spring, for example?
I'm not very optimistic about that, or I don't think that's going to happen, although I think it's in a way necessary, but that's my political opinion. But the equivalent in Kosovo would be the embassies, same way. But again, no offense to Zbogar or as the EU representative, I would always rather talk to the ambassador of the United States, ambassador of Germany, Italy as the quint, the 5 powerful countries who I think are more influential than the EU as an institution. I don't see Zbogar, for example, being that powerful, and I think it reflects the situation in the international scene. At one point, the US ambassador, Chris Dell, was worried that he was receiving phone calls every day from members of government saying, oh, this guy is not listening to me, why don't you talk to him, oh, this guy is not listening to me. And he said, you know, I'm tired of all of these daily politics in Kosovo, but this is what people expect. And you know, I see a positive movement from some of the ambassadors decided to take a more careful approach, letting things go on, because I think it's necessary.